Welcome to the Bible and today's culture. We're just beginning the subject of government in the government domain. We've been through business and economics, science and health. We're into the third domain of eight with the domain of government. So, what are the government biblical objectives that we're looking for? What's God think about government? The fact is, He thinks a lot about government. So, in general, this is kind of God's thinking on government. Authority comes from the bottom to the top. In other words, the authority of government comes from the people that elect the government. So, in some ways, God is giving up His power because He's letting the people choose whatever government that they want. Secondly, the government is representative. Another way of saying that is people get the government that they choose. Again, God's giving up His choice and His power about government because we get the government we choose. The government should be as local as possible. We saw that when they chose judges, they began by choosing judges for 100 people, like 10 families. So had big families, 10 in a family, probably 10 families. That's how local government was started when God told Moses to have people elect a judicial system of government. The prime responsibility of government is justice. So, because justice is needed for liberty. You don't have any freedom if you don't have justice. Justice follows written laws. In other words, justice is a contract. Could be the Constitution, could be the Magna Carta, it could be the Ten Commandments. But it's a written contract saying this is how we're going to live. And finally, government and the church are separated. A big point we're going to make in this study of the domain. There's a tension between government that provides justice and a church which promotes truth and grace. They don't always do the same thing, and they are always in tension with each other. So, what is the source of government authority? So it's in Genesis and Deuteronomy we get some of the essence of what God's vision for government was. So here in Genesis, it starts with God telling Adam and Eve, fill and subdue the earth. You're in charge of it. And then the next thing, He said, name all the creatures. In other words, take an inventory of everything that you're in charge of. Soon He talked about the fact that we're responsible for other people, and He holds us accountable for that. Well, Cain was the one that wasn't responsible, and so God gave him a punishment and the beginning of laws and accountability in a culture. And 14 verses later, Lamech killed somebody, and he expected to be punished. He expected to be held accountable for that. So God's message got through to the people in the culture quickly that there's going to be order and law and responsibility. And then in Deuteronomy, God talks about our role in government, the leadership of government. And the first thing that happened in Deuteronomy was that people chose the judges. They voted for them. And then, but they had a question about whether they were going on the right procedure. God had said, go into the land and possess it and take it. It's what I promised you would get. And they said, this looks like some pretty big guys over there. I think we ought to check this out. So God said, okay, if that's what you want to do. And so they chose 12 spies. They went over, 10 out of the 12. Said, no, those guys are big guys. I don't think we're ready for them. And they decided not to go for war. And then God said, well, I don't think you're the right people to do this. I think maybe we ought to wait till we get a new generation and we live in the desert for 40 years. And the people said, what? Live in the desert for 40 more years? No, we'll go for the war. And God says, you're not ready for that. This isn't going to work for you. And if you choose to do it now, you're going to fail. And they said, nope, we're going to do it. So the essence of all of this is that God made them responsible for the government that they had. They elected judges. They decided whether they're going to war or not, decide whether they're going to follow God's instructions or not. And they ended up going to battle. They lost the battle, and they stayed in the desert for 40 years until a new generation developed, and then they entered in at Jericho. So God here in Deuteronomy gets more specific about his vision of what a government should be. He said, first of all, there's going to be a Supreme Court. And we'll talk about this more later, but it's going to be made up of Levites, who were the constitutional experts, and it's going to be made up of the judges that the people chose. So, and then Moses said, and there's going to be no bribes. Whatever you do, you're going to treat everybody the same. And as you'll see, whether they are rich people or poor people, famous people or not, they all get the same treatment. Well, that's what he says here. You're going to be impartial. Aliens and Hebrews, so immigrants, non-Jewish people, were treated the same under the law as the Hebrew people were. And the same with the rich and the poor. And then God said, you have to thoroughly investigate all the charges. So you make sure that you really know all the facts, and that when you make a judgment on your people, these were the elected judges of the people, you're going to make a right decision. And people are going to respect the justice that's delivered by the government. And finally, he said, if you disobey the courts, the judges, you disagree with decisions, and it goes all the way up through the court system and all the way to the Supreme Court, which at that time was Moses. If you don't agree, and everybody has said you're wrong, and if you don't agree, the end of that is capital punishment. Where did that come from? Well, there isn't anything in Scripture that indicates that God dislikes anything more than anarchy, okay? A poor government doing a decent job of executing justice is so much better than anarchy, when we have a French Revolution sort of approach to life. So, where did democracy come from? If you would look in literature, the common answer is it came from Athens. Well, here's the story of Athens. Athens, where elections were used to choose an oligarchic institution. Most political officers were chosen by lot. So only 10% of the people in Athens were eligible to vote, okay? It was an oligarchy. And they voted for like the town council, the key people in there. After that, all the other political offices, dog catcher or policeman or whatever, were chosen by lot. They just played rock, paper, scissors, and you won, and you're the dog catcher. So everybody didn't vote, and not all the offices were even elected. Well, a second choice, if you really research it, is that the first recorded popular elections of officials in public office by majority vote, where all the citizens were eligible to vote and all the citizens were able to hold public office, dates back to Sparta in 754. So Athens was in the 500s, this was in 754, and that's what the literature says is the origin of democracy. But the Bible says that in 1450 BC, the first recorded elections were held. And this is what Moses said to Israel. Choose wise and understanding and knowledgeable men from among your tribes, and I will make them heads over you. And you answered me and said, this thing which you have told us is good. So Moses suggested a plan. The people agreed to the plan. So basically, they voted for the plan. So I took the heads of your tribes after the election, the people you'd voted for. I took the heads of your tribes, wise and knowledgeable men, and made them heads over you, leaders
of thousands, leaders of hundreds, leaders of 50s, leaders of tens, and officers for your tribes. It's very similar to what we do in the United States. We have an election, and then somebody else swears them in. So they had an election, and Moses swore them into their offices. Moses went into more detail about what they were supposed to do in this judicial system. Moses said, "Hear the cases between your brethren and the judge righteously, between a man and his brother, a stranger who is with him. You shall not show partiality in judgment. You shall hear the small as well as the great. You shall not be afraid of any man's presence, for the judgment is God's. And the case that is too hard for you, bring it to me, and I will hear it." So initially, Moses was the Supreme Court. We'll see later that changed when Moses died and somebody else replaced him. But all the cases went up through the courts from the lowest to the highest court, and the Supreme Court in the beginning was Moses. So my question is, why are so few Christians in political office, in city councils and school boards? Let me tell you about my church. There's 2,000 people in my church. We have a population between the two cities that we draw from of 80,000 people. And there are 15 positions to vote for, 5 on each city council and the school board. So over the last 40 years, just by chance, we should have held 4 offices. We should have 4 people in office as a result of the population in our church and who we voted for. Well, that really wasn't possible because only 2 people even ran for political office, one for the school board and one for a city council. So even if everybody voted, we wouldn't have had the number of people in office that we should have just by chance, just by doing the numbers. It seems like that's the way it is nationwide. Only 25% of all believers actually vote in elections. We are ignoring the governments that God expects us to be involved in. Why is that? I mean, we have the Bible. We can read that God started the first democratic system in Israel, and on it goes with much talk about government in the Old Testament and some in the New Testament. So why is that? Well, I was talking to my friend Mike, who lives in a town two towns down from me, and I was saying, I'm really wondering why we don't get involved in our city and school governments. And he says, well, that's not a problem in my church. What do you mean? He says, well, we were going to build a second church in town. So we went before the city council. And people said, this isn't fair. Because 3 of the 5 council members are from your church. And I said, why did that happen for you? He said, because our pastors in their sermons talk regularly about our role in government and that we need to be involved. And so he had a majority of people from his church on the city council. The problem is we have secular, sacred split thinking. We think part of life is sacred, and that's what interests God, and those things in our minds are being a pastor, being on the board of the church, being a member of the church, teaching Sunday school, or maybe being a missionary. And besides that, there aren't other things that are all that important to God. So we put all of our emphasis on things within the walls of the church. And we have many churches like mine that don't even get the offices, the chance to serve because people don't vote and people don't run. So here's some questions for you to discuss. So read them, take some time in discussing them. When you're through, don't miss this podcast. It's not a video, it's podcast, and it's fairly long. But I selected it because I thought it was really good on the subject that we're talking about. If you have time, listen to that podcast. If you have more time, discuss it. So next week, we're going to talk about the separation of church and state, the separation of church and government. Okay, enjoy your discussions. We'll see you next time. Thanks.